Beautiful music drifted through the air. The wind carried Perial's symphony all across the estate, and soon, from the servants to the maids, everyone was asleep. Karina looked around in wonder. Perial's ability was truly amazing. The letter she wrote was a farewell of sorts, telling them not to pay her any attention anymore. There was no one in this mansion that she wanted to give her final goodbye to. The Count wouldn't believe Karina to be truly sick until he saw her cold, lifeless body in a coffin. Only then would he regret. Only then would he cry tears of despair as she had, all throughout her childhood. He would let out tears of anger at her, at causing her parents such heartache. He never spared her a glance when she was healthy and alive, when she desperately longed for his attention. She looked up, surprised to find Abelia sleeping against a pillar. Perial carried Abelia to her room. Perial noticed Karina's old paintings on Abelia's bedside table. He glanced up to find Karina looking at her sister with gentle eyes, affection shining through. He was confused because he'd thought she disliked her family. As they left Abelia's room, Perial asked her about her relationship with her family. Everyone saw an harmonious family, genuine happiness amongst them, but all that was achieved through sacrifice of one's happiness. Her happiness. As long as Abelia was sick, Frick the good, talented son, and Peridot a troublemaker, she would never be able to live here for herself. She wanted to live for herself for the first time, even if it was only for a short while. She wanted to be remembered as Karina the painter, not Karina Leopold. The Count entered the mansion, and the butler gave a report. A strange phenomenon had occurred. Everyone had fallen asleep after hearing what sounded like music, and no one could recall anything before it happened. He walked into the office and saw a strange letter on his desk. The butler didn't know where the letter had come from. How did it get there? The Count opened it, suspicion in his eyes. Had an intruder entered the property? As he read it, what drew his attention was the font. Why was it so familiar? It dawned on him as he read on. It couldn't be. Karina. It was indeed a letter from Karina. After half a year with no contact from his eldest daughter, she'd left a letter that was surprisingly concise and neat, almost indifferent. Please consider this letter as a last goodbye. You always told me to behave myself well as the daughter of Count Leopold, or I shouldn't even think to consider myself as part of this family otherwise. And I've done well for the most part. So please stop blaming this name that will resonate throughout the South. My name will spread far and wide, not as Karina Leopold, but as Karina the painter. She told him about how she'd always felt as if a stranger in the Leopold family because of his scolding and cold attitude towards her. Where she was now, there was someone who made her heart flutter. There was no one to raise hands to her or threaten to throw her out. There was no sick Abelia or well-talented Frick here to steal her light, because now she'd finally stepped into the light. She was finally the protagonist of her own story. The Count grew angry. Did she not appreciate all that was done for her? Why didn't she tell them about her disease? She could have mentioned it. They were, after all, her family. Her next words froze him to the ground. Before you ask yourself, why didn't I tell you, let me ask you one question. Did I really not say anything? Like puzzle pieces falling apart, memories of Karina never crying. Since when did she stop crying and asking for anything? When did she stop talking to them about how she truly felt? She told him if he wanted to meet her, he should come to the north himself. Her next words shook him to the core, and he threw the letter in a fit of anger. She told him she would deal with her death as she pleased. He shouted at the butler to contact the Duke at once. They needed to bring Karina back. Karina was an obedient child. She would have never wrote those things in that letter. But the butler told him it was impossible because the northern borders were closed now. But the Count couldn't be calm. Karina couldn't really be sick. The butler told him she may very well be, because a few months ago the maids heard the eldest lady violently coughing and vomiting in her room. Why didn't they report it to him? The Count was furious. But they did report it, and the Count told them to stop reporting to him because he was very busy with work. Karina was old enough to take care of herself after all. Outside his office, Abelia stood in despair at the conversation she'd just overheard. Big Sister Karina was sick? Distantly, she heard the Count ask the butler to bring a pen. He needed to write a letter to Duke Pastelio, and when Karina returned, they would have a proper conversation. But Abelia knew it already. Karina would not be returning. What she thought was a dream, her lovely sister whispering to her to stay healthy. It was not a dream. She walked to her room in a daze and crumpled to the floor. Her legs gave out. She cried for her sister that she missed, for her sister that she would never see again. Karina sat on the bed as she thought about her little sister. She always wanted Abelia to stay healthy, but she had neglected herself like an afterthought. What a fool she was. She grasped the little purse that she always had and walked to the window. She drew a bird, and it glowed golden as it came to life. The bird grabbed the purse and took to the sky. It soared high as it glided over mountains and a lake. That was where it let go, and the little purse plummeted into the lake. It sunk into the water just like any hold her family had over her. She'd let go of her attachment to that purse, just as Karina had let go of her attachments to her family. Millian and Karina had decided to have tea in the greenhouse, and Periel had decided to join them, much to Millian's annoyance. Karina had invited him to their little tea party, he said with a smug smile. She had invited him to celebrate the beginning of their friendship. She apologized for doing so without Millian's permission, but he just waved her off. She didn't need to apologize for that. He asked about Karina's plans for the day, but Periel answered that Karina would be studying with him. I didn't ask you, he'd told Periel. They bickered back and forth for a while until they heard Karina's soft giggle. They were surprised at her abrupt laugh, but she only told them with a lovely smile what good friends they seemed to be. Having such comfortable conversations and being able to share laughs while eating delicious food. This was something she'd never thought she'd have. This was given to her by none other than Millian himself. He told her not to overdo it, always concerned for her. She agreed with a beautiful smile. She couldn't describe how much affection she felt for him, how much she liked him, she thought to herself. Millian had to leave the territory for an inspection, and he might not be returning until tomorrow. He told Karina, and she told him to be careful. He blushed at her show of concern for him. Karina was saddened because she might not see Millian for a while, but he told her, as he brushed her hair aside, he would bring her an even better heron. Karina blushed at Millian's affectionate gaze. On the other side of the table, Periel watched what seemed like a married couple instead of two people who were about to break off their engagement. Was the impenetrable Millian able to smile so freely? Karina felt a sudden pain in her chest. As she looked at them laughing and talking, dizziness overcame her. She excused herself and left the room. Millian questioned Periel about Karina's illness, but Periel refused to talk about it. He had made a promise to Karina, he told Millian. Millian was shocked because they were so adamant at keeping this information from him. He didn't understand why. Periel couldn't tell Millian that Karina was going to die. She'd told Periel that she didn't want to leave Millian with a bad memory, and he had to respect her wishes. Periel tried to lighten the mood and teased Millian about his belief in the northern superstition. Millian grew annoyed and playfully threatened Periel as he headed for the door. Millian was curious about what sort of studying they were going to do, but Periel told Millian it was a secret. Back inside, a maid stood outside Karina's room, concerned. Was the lady okay? The lady made strange sounds. She told the maid that she was fine after the maid entered and found her on the floor. She'd just stumbled, she lied. She just needed to rest. But the maid informed her that the doctor should be called right away if anything happens to the lady, at the insistence of Master Millian. She requested for the maid to call Winston. As the maid left, Karina stood with clenched fists. She was fine for now. Everything was still fine. Winston checked her pulse and told Karina that her disease hasn't deteriorated to a serious degree, but it had gotten worse. She smiled and told him she suspected as much. Winston told her he'd give her a much stronger medication. She asked him if she'd continue vomiting in the future. She didn't want Millian to see such an unsightly side to her. Because vomiting was a symptom of heart disease, she'd likely continue to reject the food she eats in the future. But it shouldn't stop her from eating. Her body was like a sandcastle, getting hit with wave after raging wave. It could crumble at any moment. Eating would at least give her body fuel to continue to fight to survive. Her body was, after all, getting worse at every moment. She asked the doctor if that's all it took to stay better for now, but he told her she needed to have the will to live too. She thought about his words. She didn't want to wait for death as she did before. She wanted to cherish every moment and live happily like everyone else. She wanted her family to remember her name when she died as Karina the artist. She would part ways with Millian after creating fond memories together. Winston asked if she'd felt any pain, and she told him her heart. She was fine all day, but suddenly found it hard to breathe. Then she'd felt a sudden pain so unbearable, she'd rather her heart exploded instead of feeling such excruciating pain again. She realized what she said and apologized, but Winston understood because his eyes felt like that too at times. Because each patient has different symptoms, Winston couldn't give a proper treatment and he apologized for it. But Karina told him how sorry she was to have burdened him and Periel with such a secret. She didn't have to apologize to him because it was his job to take care of the sick. "Okay," she said, but guilt masked her face. "You don't have to apologize to me too," Periel spoke up from the doorway. He had overheard their conversation. He'd come by because there was something he'd wanted to ask Karina. Winston got up to leave. Before he left, he told her not to give up. If she wanted to live longer, he'd do everything in his power to help her. She thanked him with a smile. She regretted it now. If she had known such beautiful things had awaited her outside the Leopold mansion, she would have left sooner. She wouldn't have waited until her death was around the corner. To have only gained the courage to leave with death on her doorstep seemed rather silly now. Winston left, and Karina asked Periel about his question. He looked contemplative, then told her that although her ability was different from others, it was unusually fast. "Fast?" Karina questioned. He explained that the reason artists died so quickly was because they created and performed many miracles. But even those who performed miracles every day and created more art than her had lived longer than her. He asked her if she had perchance performed any taboos while using her miracle, things she was never supposed to do. But of course, Periel understood. If Karina had grown up as a beloved daughter as she deserved, and not left alone in neglected indifference, things wouldn't have gone so far. She would have at least had an art teacher to teach her about her miracle and the taboos that came with it. He explained that art disease doesn't suddenly come about. It was a disease that gradually worsened the more you'd misuse your miracle. It was the price you'd pay for using your miracle past its limit. There are no artists who don't have a limit to their ability. Once you surpass those limits, only then do you go about contracting the disease. But the most fundamental taboos that shouldn't ever be broken were resurrection of the dead, playing with the universal figure of time, that is, do not try to turn back time, and the creation of humans. Plants and animals as well as beasts didn't apply to this rule, because the creation of men is something that was done by God himself. We, as his creations, were not allowed to create humans from our miracles. That sole power belonged to God himself. The last taboo to never attempt was the use of your miracle to take a life. So what would happen if a taboo was attempted? Karina questioned. The price for that would be your life or to be maimed in some way. He asked her if she'd ever done any of the taboos he listed. She glanced away nervously. "I've never done anything you mentioned," she answered hesitantly. Periel was confused. How was Karina's art disease so severe if she'd never performed any taboo before? "Do you think I would get better if I could find the cause of my condition?" she questioned, her eyes downcast. Right away, she realized how ridiculous her question was. There was no cure for art disease. She apologized for asking such a silly question, but Perial told her that while he doesn't know of a cure for art disease, he had thought of a way to slow down its progression. If she could paint but stop before the last stroke of her brush, her work would be unfinished, and that would prevent her from triggering her miracle. All she needed to do was provide the best unfinished work she could possibly do, and Perial was certain he could make her the most famous painter out there. "It's not difficult if it's done with your talent," he told her confidently. He held out his hand, and she grabbed it. She thanked him for helping her with so little time left. Perial blushed at Karina's beauty. He startled as she called his name. He told her they would somehow find a way to help her with her disease. Because Karina had opened the door and began this journey, they were there to walk this path alongside her and to help her when she stumbled until the end. Karina sat out on the balcony. The air was chilly, but she enjoyed it as she waited for Millian. She wrote down in her notebook all she wanted to do. She had already made a friend. The next would be to give a gift to someone she liked, or pack lunch for him. Maybe a hug? She blushed at her thoughts. Ridiculous Karina! Millian watched her from the doorway. How cute she was, he thought. Almost like a puppy. He spoke up, which startled her, and she got up, excited. Was he done with all his business? But he told her he'd only be busier now because he would have to go out for a full-scale subjugation. He'd come to see her before leaving because he was worried about how she'd left earlier. She told him she was fine now that Winston had seen to her. He'd wanted to talk about her art disease, but remembered Perial's words and instead told her to take good care of herself. When would she see him again? How long would she have to wait? He promised to see her the day after tomorrow at lunch. He'd felt silly for making such a promise, but she surprised him as she told him happily that she'd wait for him. Millian rode out with his knights at a breakneck speed. His chief commander told him that the knights couldn't keep up. They had to slow down, but he only said that they needed to be back by noon the day after tomorrow so they wouldn't be slowing down. They reached the entrance to the forest infested with demonic beasts and decided to set up camp there. They would head in deeper as soon as the rest of the night order arrived. Millian thought about the progenitor of the Pestelio family. He was the hero sent to drive out demonic beasts that had roamed these lands. Now it was Millian's responsibility to get rid of these starved beasts that attacked villages during the winter. Karina's words came to mind. His promise to hug her when she would eventually leave. He needed to slay more beasts so that he could give Karina more herons. Karina had decided to go for a walk out in the cold winter weather. She was so eager to meet Millian when he got back, she'd unknowingly wandered to the front gate. And that was where Winston had found her. He scolded her lightly for waiting out in the cold, but she just couldn't seem to calm down. She assured Winston that she was dressed very warmly, and she'd even brought a blanket with her. Winston noted how much happier she looked now, so different from the first time they'd met. She was much happier now because she could do things she'd never dreamed of doing before. She'd wrote a letter to the Count, she told Winston, telling them not to worry about her anymore, and that she'd become a famous painter so that she could pay them back for the grace they'd bestowed on her, feeding her and clothing her. And once she paid them back, there would truly be nothing between them. Although they were her parents, that didn't mean they could dictate the way she lived her life. She looked at him as if seeking assurance on her decision. Winston agreed. They did not own Karina. Children were the blessings given to parents, there to nurture and protect. Eventually, they would have to leave the warm embrace of their parents to live their lives. Children would come back to hold their parents' hands because they were good parents and they cherished each other. It was a pity Karina never had such parents to be proud of. Karina just smiled and said, "It's okay." Now she didn't have time to look back on what she'd missed. She only looked forward, cherishing every precious moment she had left. She continued to smile. Spring had finally entered her life after a harsh, bitter winter. Millian announced that they would be entering deeper into the forest. One of their targets was a demonic beast, Hertha. He told them its weak points and where to attack. Under its claws as well as the soft underbelly, which was unprotected without any shell covering. He commanded them as a leader should. Their aim was to procure a heron. As luck would have it, a Hertha had just approached. The knights spread out to attack, but the beast let out a loud screech. Suddenly, pairs of eyes glowed from the shadows, surrounding Millian and his knights. The beast had called upon more of its kind with a screech. Millian slashed it with his sword, in a frenzy of strikes. Excitement coursed through him, a crazed smile on his face. Were demonic beasts this smart? It had ambushed them with its own fleet of monsters, blocking Millian and the knights' escape route. Millian struck one of its weak points and it fell to the ground, dead. He turned and told his soldiers to strike the monster's weak points, but another beast appeared behind him, which took him by surprise. It lunged at him. The bolter convinced Karina to head back to the mansion instead of waiting for Millian out in the biting cold. As she headed to the carriage, the soldiers shouted out. A swarm of beasts had approached the walls. The butler left to see what had happened and told Karina to rest in the carriage. Karina winced. The unexpected pain in her chest took her by surprise. She would head to the residence soon. She just needed to be patient. But it seemed the soldiers couldn't fend off the monsters, and they weren't sure when would Millian return. They needed help. She glanced at her case with her art tools. She could help. She just needed to draw the Hertha she'd drawn before. It was almost complete, but it still lacked something. She saw a knife and something sinister whispered to her, urging her, "Use your own blood and flesh as ingredients. Make your creation powerful." As the butler spoke to the soldiers, a Hertha suddenly smashed through the wall. The soldiers readied themselves to attack, but the lady's voice stopped them. This Hertha was Karina's creation. She spoke to her creation. "Could you please hold off the other monsters until help arrives?" she'd asked. The beast growled and stomped its way through another wall, attacking the other beasts. The butler noticed a small cut on Karina's hands, but she told him she'd only scratched herself. The soldiers gasped in awe, startling Karina and the butler. She looked to see her own Hertha fighting off the other monsters in a frenzy. She heard a voice. She looked around in confusion. Was she the only one to hear that voice? She realized it was the beast talking. She could hear its thoughts. It was hungry. It needed to eat. If it didn't find something to eat, it would die. The beast spoke as if in a trance. It started eating the other beasts, searching for herons. Karina covered her ears, trying to stop its thoughts from entering her mind, but she couldn't, and she ran down the stairs and shouted out. She told it to let the other beasts go. Why did it need to eat? But it didn't answer. A stampede of hooves sounded on the ground. Millian had arrived. He tried to protect Karina from the Hertha, but she told him this one was hers. But her eyes hadn't changed color, Millian pointed out. "But that's impossible." Karina was surprised too. This had never happened before. Back at the mansion, a servant told Periel that Millian waited for him in the garden. As he entered, he was taken by surprise as he saw a nervous-looking Karina, a very angry-looking Millian and a beast behind them. They sat in tense silence. They'd moved to have a conversation inside. Karina tried to explain that she had no choice but to create Hertha because they needed the help her creation provided, but apologized for breaking her promise not to create any summoned beasts. Millian let out a sigh and told her it wasn't her fault. If only he'd gotten there sooner. But please be more careful in the future, he told her. He heard from the butler that she'd hurt her hand. She glanced away guiltily and told him wasn't important. Periel interrupted them and asked Karina to make the beast disappear, but she couldn't. She'd tried several times to no avail. Fortunately, it still listened to her, so it wasn't dangerous. Did she have any idea why she couldn't make it disappear? She told Periel. It seemed to be looking for something. Before she could continue, blood dripped from her lips. Where was the pain that usually came about? She heard Millian shout out her name, but why couldn't she see him well? Millian shouted out to contact Winston. She gripped the bedding as she spoke. "I'm fine," she stuttered out. Millian tried to comfort her, but an onslaught of pain hit her, and she cried out. Her heart was going to explode. She knew it. How else could she describe this pain? Millian told her to hold on for a little longer. "Millian, it hurts." She cried as she looked at him. She couldn't die like this. Millian hugged her and tried to console her. "It's okay to shout and cry, Karina," she wailed, unable to control herself. "My heart feels like it's being ripped apart," she shouted out. Millian hugged her tightly and told her to hold on. Winston would be here soon. She went limp in his arms. Karina had fainted, unable to bear the pain. Periel and Winston rushed into the room, and Periel handed him the heron. Millian put the heron close to Karina's chest, and that seemed to ease the pain. Her face had lost that painful scowl. Periel spoke to Millian outside the room. Karina's condition might have had something to do with the beast that refused to disappear. Millian wanted to kill it, but Periel stopped him. Periel told him that the heron could very well be a cure for art disease, given how well Karina reacted to it. While Millian went on his expedition, Periel had done some research on the heron. It had resonated with his miracle as well. He'd also heard from the butler how out of control Karina's beast was. It was in such a frenzy, it had eaten the other monsters around it. Millian was stunned. It hadn't just eaten the corpses, but the live beasts, too? Periel explained that because it ate the herons from the other beasts, it could be the reason why it was out of Karina's control. But this was all in theory, so Periel would need more herons to experiment. Millian promised to bring back a lot of herons from his subjugation come midwinter, because likely these monsters would come out in droves. After her severe seizure, she'd recovered thanks to Millian, Periel, and Winston. Time flew by, and winter was upon them. Millian had become overbearing in his vigilance concerning her health. As she completed her painting, beautiful purple butterflies came to life. She'd made a mistake. She wasn't supposed to finish her paintings. She'd promised Periel. She laughed as her creations flew around her. She let them out a near window but caught the eyes of Millian. He was already looking at her. She gasped and quickly closed the window. She knew what was coming. He's angry, she thought. She looked to the door as she heard a knock. It was Millian, and she knew she was about to get a scolding. He burst in, intending to do just that, but she quickly rushed to say that it was an accident. She didn't mean to use her miracle. She was just enjoying herself, and she hadn't realized until butterflies fluttered around her. He knew she wouldn't stop painting, but he wanted to delay the inevitable. He wanted to see her for as long as possible, he said happily. She smiled a bittersweet smile. How could this man be so sweet to her? Millian sat with Periel as he explained that the pain from the disease was so excruciating, no amount of medication could numb it. Millian felt a sense of helplessness at having to watch her go through such pain. He once again agreed to help Periel with his research on herons. He watched Karina out a near window as she played with the beast. The beast has yet to disappear. Although it was good that it still obeyed Karina, there were still some strange occurrences. The fact that Karina's eyes, which usually turned golden when performing her miracle, stayed its usual deep blue, and she had heard the beast talk. He smiled as he remembered how happy she was to participate in the upcoming banquet. When did he start worrying about her? His eyes always followed her, and when she wasn't within sight, he'd become anxious, thinking she might be in pain somewhere. And every time he'd see her face, he would imagine what it would be like to kiss her. His face went crimson, and he scolded himself for thinking such way about someone sickly. Would things have been different if they'd had a proper conversation when they'd first met? Would their relationship have been different right from the start? The excitement on Karina's face shone as the carriage came to a stop. Millian had brought her to Real Lake. It was beautiful, and she found it astonishing that it wasn't frozen in winter. Millian told her that this lake wouldn't freeze no matter the temperature. but she should still take care because of how cold it was. As they walked, Millian offered her an opportunity to paint, but she refused. She wanted to enjoy her walk with Millian instead. He felt happy that she'd made him a priority, and with a playful look, she teased, "Of course. Are you honored?" Her beauty made Millian nervous, and he stuttered out a reply, quickly changing the topic. Because of her lack of knowledge of the North, he told her about the mysterious anecdote from the North. The Winter's End is about the Winter Mountain Range. It was a place so far, no one had ever ventured over those mountains, so no one knew what lay beyond it. But the occasional written passage spoke of many things that lie over those mountains. A paradise, a demonic territory. One passage even claimed that there was a supposed extinct dragon that lived there, although the story about the dragon sounded rather far-fetched. Karina told him it was fascinating because it was called the Winter's End. Perhaps what was actually beyond those cliffs was the beginning of spring. Millian was astounded at the way she thought. Winter's End was symbolic for an eternal death in the North. He wanted to see the world through Karina's eyes, he told her, because it might just be as beautiful as he imagined it to be. Karina blushed at his words. She grabbed her chest as her emotions raged out of control. She looked down, hiding her face. She'd prepared a gift for him. She took out a piece of paper and gave it to him. It was a picture of an elixir. It would be able to heal any injury. However, it couldn't bring the dead back to life, and it couldn't bring back someone who would be injured beyond recognition. She told him she'd created it. Because it didn't exist in the world, she'd imagine it and would create it later on for him. She'd wanted to help him in some way. He gazed at her as they stood in the vast open field, almost as if it was just them two in the world. He told her, "Karina, I don't need an elixir, knowing you'd go through pain to create it.